Representative Paré.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Wrenn, I have a few questions for you. Thank you for your willingness to be open about answering them. So we talked about this a little bit before. I think 4 or 5 of us have touched on this. I'm just going to get right down to the heart of the matter here. Is there an inverse relationship that can be calculated in a performance measurement by DPI with the rise in the use of technology in early grades and technology literacy and other skills, an inverse relationship there? We might have data on that nationwide, but it seems to me that would be important for us to be able to calculate that for North Carolina schools in the younger grades. For example, more use of technology in the classroom. There's only so many hours in an instructional day. So if we're putting students in front of a screen, that takes away from having them do something else that would strengthen a different skill. Common sense would suggest that. So like oral communication or handwriting. Is there any performance measurement in place that would be able to detect that?
I think one of the things you have to see when you go to most K-12, K-2 classrooms, when you see a student on a tablet, you often see a teacher working with the student with that tablet, particularly when we talk about literacy, where they can gauge specifically where a student is. So there is many times when I go to a classroom, I do not see students individually at that level working on tablets by themselves without a teacher. But then there's also the difference between passive and active engagement with the tablet. Passive is if they're just sitting there and they're reading something on a tablet. But then we also have data and research around active engagement with younger learners with a tablet, where they are working collaboratively with other students and they are moving things interactively on their screen. And we do have data that shows that that is effective with children. As far as literacy and with our learners, I'm certainly not the expert on that. We do have a division that is totally dedicated to early learning and literacy, but I can say on the research with technology, it is showing that students can interact and make growth using those tools just as effectively as traditional tools.
Follow up?
A series of questions.
I guess I understand that, and I would imagine that's correct, but there has to be some sort of relationship. I mean, I understand it can be interactive being on a tablet, but it's not the same as sitting in a group and talking to people without a tablet. Or instead of being on a tablet and typing and pointing and using your finger, that's different from sitting and drawing on a piece of paper and writing on a piece of paper. So those are different skills, and maybe you can get to sort of a portion of the interactive skill while using a tablet. It would seem to me that it would make sense for DPI to be looking at what kind of inverse relation. There has to be one, I would imagine, there when it comes to these other life skills of interacting with people and writing down on a piece of paper, using your hands. Don't you think that would make sense to really put a performance measurement in place so we can have some data to go on before we invest so much in technology in our classrooms in the early grades? Or even put down a standard for teachers to use for how much time during instructional day should be dedicated to devices versus building these other skills without a device.
I think it's important to note that if you have tablets in a classroom, that doesn't mean that sitting around reading without a tablet is not happening. Just because you have tablets in the classroom, they're being used at the appropriate time when it makes sense to use those. That doesn't mean because they're there, you are not using traditional methods that get results of sitting, talking, and interacting. So even though the technology's there, that doesn't mean that you walk into a classroom and every child's going to be on a tablet the whole time. It's used when it needs to be used. And that's what we train teachers on. When is it effective to use this technology? When do you get better results? There are times when we would tell teachers, no, you shouldn't use that for this. You need to go back to sitting, talking, interacting. So I think that's the most important thing to note there. Certainly I would love to investigate that data as well.
Do you think that recognizing a healthy balance, I think that we all agree with. Just recognizing that there should be a healthy balance without a standard is acceptable for parents who are concerned about too much use of a technology and screens in the classroom in those younger grades. Meaning, yes, there should be a healthy balance, but if there isn't a standard there, do you think that parents who are concerned about that would be happy with that answer?
Well, as I said earlier, there absolutely has to be a healthy standard. There have been guidelines put out, somewhat like when we used to say homework. No more, if you're 5 years old, you shouldn't have more than 5 minutes of homework. I don't know if you remember those standards. But we have put out similar standards on recommended practices for screen time. And if I'm remembering correctly, it did correlate with the age of a child. But we also recognize it might be different for some children. So if you put out, you can't be on the screen more than 5 minutes, that might not work for a child who might need 10 minutes. So I think you've got to work on teachers using their expertise and making sure that we have put out enough guidance on this is too much time. You must stop and break. One of the things we talk about is taking healthy, active brain breaks throughout the day, not just with screen time, but all the things that we're doing. So I do agree with you, there has to be a healthy balance. And I do know there are some metrics that have been put out there, but I also know that we're not always a one size fits all.
I'd like to see at some point, if we have it, some data on the increase in technology and that inverse relationship in oral communication and writing skills and drawing skills. And if we have that, I think that would be interesting to see that. My second question, and this is sort of from a cost-wise standpoint, for technology, you have districts in the state that might be able to, through a blended funding model, which you talked about earlier, there are some areas that have local funding that can help with technology needs, perhaps well-funded PTAs, local sources, etc., that might be able to take a PSU from a standard basic technology need to some more advanced device, the latest and greatest. And that's a choice for those school units or that district based on what they can afford and their resources. So I guess I'm asking, is there any thought or process in place if you're going to move to basic device A to latest and greatest device B, what happens to all the device A's in that school? And can we transfer those to a school in need who doesn't have the resources that school B does? Or is that cost prohibitive to coordinate that?
So a lot of that already happens. We talked about how some devices can last more than 4 years, but a lot of times they have a much more higher entry point. So when you are able to buy the certain devices that might cost more, yes, they do last longer. What typically happens for our districts that do have a refresh cycle, they will take devices that they say, these are no longer usable for this. Now we're going to repurpose these as loaners or move them down to another school that might not have enough. We've even had informal collaboration between districts where they'll say, we no longer need these. Would you all like to discuss how we could work out some type of agreement? So informally, those things do happen. But formally, anytime a device is looked at, this might not be good enough to use for this purpose. There are many ways that they look at repurposing those throughout the district, either for parts, loaners, kiosks, signage, or different ways that they'll look at using those devices till literally the last breath is taken.
Is there any requirement for them to do that, given some of those devices were paid by taxpayer funds?
Before any device can get surplused at the state level, but certainly at the LEA level, the CTO has to sign off before they can surplus that item that, yes, this is worthy to be surplused. It doesn't have any other purpose or use for us. So there are guidelines, particularly around items that are purchased with federal dollars as well as state dollars.
Is that part of the aggregate inventory and utilization data that you ask from public school units?
Yes.
Okay, and that's public information?
It is. It is. And one of the things that I mentioned and that I think is very important, we are revising those questions because now that we have more technology, there's more answers that we need that we just don't have right now. So we actually have a team that's been working for 6 months on revising what that looks like to give us that information.
So if devices are paid for by taxpayer money and they sit in a warehouse, do you have any information on the cost of just having those devices and that technology not being utilized for a different purpose? I guess what I'm getting at is the cost to the state or the district to be holding devices that still have life in them that were just circled out for a better option in some of these districts that haven't been put to another use but are still usable.
I'm not aware of that happening anywhere. Typically, our districts are so hungry for devices that before they order them, they know exactly where every device is going and what it needs to be used for. So I'm not aware of a surplus of usable equipment that is sitting somewhere not being used.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Harvey, thank you for being here, and I appreciate you answering my questions. One thing that stuck out to me in your presentation was you mentioned the potential for students to be denied a meal. My kids go to public school, and that kind of surprised me when I heard you say that because of course, kids, especially in the lower grades, sometimes they forget their lunch or they don't have their lunch money with them that day, and they usually receive a meal, a base meal, peanut butter and jelly sandwich, fruit cup, whatever, and they're okay for the rest of the day. So I'm curious if that's a real concern. Where is that happening? Before the pandemic began, in what schools and where in North Carolina were children being denied a meal?
Good question. We share your concerns. Each local board of education is responsible for establishing its meal charge policy, and those meal charge policies vary from district to district. Many, of course, as you have just suggested, are concerned about denying meals, especially to elementary children. So there may be a fund, if you will, that the principal may use at his or her discretion to help support those meal charges that could be reimbursed. We see in middle and high schools, that's not necessarily the case. Districts are concerned about skyrocketing meal debt. We've seen some districts in the past absorb up to $300,000, $400,000 in unpaid meal debt, which then has to be paid by the local education unit from its general education funds. So as each Board of Education does develop its policy, this is where you may see a generous policy that says you may charge up to 10 meals before we can no longer provide a meal for you, and then would provide a meal that consists of a cheese sandwich and fruit, for example. Now, we have to be careful about what that alternate meal looks like because I don't know about you, but a lot of children I know really like cheese sandwiches and fruit. So we have to make sure that we're not rewarding that kind of behavior, but making sure that children are nourished. And I'd be happy to share with you outside of our discussion today a survey we conducted in 2019 to examine these meal charges that lets us know district by district where that tendency to deny meals actually resides. I do believe that for the most part, our educators want to do all they can to make sure children are nourished. I think there are very difficult decisions that local boards of education have to make about the use of resources.
Follow up? But I guess what I'm trying to get at is and you said this several times about being denied a meal. So if that's realistic, that some kids around the state are being denied a meal, going the whole school day without a meal, that has to be based on a realistic scenario of that actually happening.
It does.
Okay, so where is it happening? Where has it happened?
It happens throughout the state, depending upon that local meal charge. Each local board of education is, in fact, required to establish that meal charge.
Okay, so there are children who are being denied a lunch.
There are.
Basic peanut butter and jelly sandwich because if they forgot their lunch. And this has happened before the pandemic began.
It did. It did. And in fact, it was that phenomena that led to our discussions with this legislative body. We wanted to prevent that, especially for children who qualified for reduced price meals. When we think of a household not being able to afford 70 cents per day, let's say there are 3 children in the household, the concern was if we could prevent the denial of a meal to this group of children who do qualify for reduced price meals, we could close the gap on having meals denied to these children. Where we are concerned is those children who are outside of that range that we mentioned earlier, 185% of poverty up to 225% of poverty. These children do not have access to meal benefits. They are denied meal benefits. They have nutrition needs. They often have no meal money. Again, depending upon that local policy, they may be denied a meal.
I guess I would just maybe ask for that information and hard numbers.
Be happy to.
I'd like to see what schools where in North Carolina, going back pre-pandemic, maybe the last 5-7 years,
Right.
that have been denying children a meal. If you know that to be the case,
Yes.
I think that information, that hard data would be useful to me.
And I may add to that we have a special provision called the Community Eligibility Provision, which is a part of the National School
Dr.
Budget.
Harvey, I'm going to interrupt because of time.
Okay.
I think you're going to get the information that
Yes.
she's requested
Be happy to.
prior to the pandemic.
Be happy to do.
Okay. Representative Paré.
Thank you. So the drop in participation in the free lunch program, why do you think that is?
I think there are several reasons. Number one, I think we've seen a drop in participation as we've seen the nutrition standards become a bit more stringent. Children are not accustomed to the taste of healthier meals at school, shall we say, because their palates are often based upon other less healthful foods. Kids like what kids like. I think adults like what adults like as well. But I think as we have seen this program evolve into a nutrition program with tighter nutrition standards, children are having to acquire the taste for whole grain rich products. I'll give an example. Biscuits, which are a staple in the South. A whole grain rich biscuit is a different creature than a soft, flaky biscuit. It's more chewy, it's more crumbly, it's harder, it's more dense. When children taste that, they think, this is different. This is bad.
Can I interrupt you for one
Sure.
moment? I'm sorry. So the drop in participation at the levels that we have seen, the numbers that you put up on the board. So to me, that would mean the need went down, right? I mean, to me, that is an interpretation I think probably all of us have, is that there's just not as much of a need for that. Not so much the appreciation for the taste of the food has changed, but to me, it's more of a need-based data point. Anyway, but and if there's any kind of actual data that you can give us to support your reasoning for that versus mine, I'd like to see that. But to me, that makes a lot of sense. When you're talking about the nutrition of kids coming to school hungry because their parents or their families are in a food need situation and they cannot fall into the income parameters to receive a free and reduced lunch. Are you taking into account the participation of food banks? I mean, we as a body has appropriated additional monies to support food banks in this latest appropriation bill, and I know our local food bank does a lot to support families and children, especially track-out bags, to supplement a nutrition need. It just, to me, making the reason of we have to do this because children are not getting sufficient nutrition at home has to be based on some sort of hard data, not just maybe anecdotal, or they're not hungry today, or they're very hungry today, therefore they're not receiving proper meals at home. I'm not sure I understand where these conclusions are coming from about the quality of nutrition at the home versus and how that data is being collected at the school if they don't fall into those parameters of being able to take advantage of the free and reduced lunch and the existing rules there. So I guess it seems to me there's a little bit of a guessing going on or assumptions being made. I'm just looking for some concrete data that you're making the determination that children outside of or beyond the traditional brackets of what receiving the free and reduced lunch, there's a need there beyond that, and I'm looking at participation levels going down. I'm looking at, a support of food banks, and you're telling me that the nutrition is lacking at home for these same kids who don't qualify for free and reduced lunch. I'm just wondering where you're getting that from.
And I think we're looking at national data from those who are in the business of collecting hunger data.
Okay, so that's national data you're
Yes.
getting that from?
Yes.
Not North Carolina data or district level data?
Yes, what we would have would be anecdotal in our state.
Okay, the cost of a lunch and the difference between what it used to be $3 something, now $5, can you break down that? What is making up the $5.97 or whatever it was versus the $3 something? Is it?
Well, we can see food cost is typically at least 40% of that school nutrition dollar. Labor costs should ideally be 40% of that, but we're seeing that labor costs are exceeding that, upwards of 50%. There's also the consideration of direct expenditures like the equipment, purchase of equipment, the purchase of food preparation supplies, the payment of indirect cost. All of these factors that go into the sustenance of the school meals program go into the makeup of that cost per meal equivalent. And the school nutrition program largely is, at this point, a self-sustaining operation. It attempts to produce, to support meal participation in a manner that will generate the revenues needed for sustainability.
So if we broke down those two numbers, the cost of a meal pre-pandemic, the cost of a meal now, we would see the cost, the food prices, the supply chain issues, all of that correlate nationally with what we're seeing with rising prices.
That's correct. We believe so.
And because we got to wrap this up.
Thank you, Chair. Just really quickly, just a little mini story. So my kids go to public school, both of my children, and we do the prepaid lunch thing when they don't take their lunch in the morning. About 2 days ago, my daughter came home and said, I was able to get today for free this really cool, yummy ice cream frozen treat. And it was great. And I thought, okay, did she use her account for that? And the answer was no. She just got a free, yummy treat because they were free. So when we talk about determining what need is, I mean, we're not a family in need. So who's paying for that free treat that my daughter, who doesn't need it, who has money in her account, is enjoying at lunch? I mean, the money has to come from somewhere. So I just think as a general principle, it would really, I think it's proper for all of us to really determine actual need based on real life data and statistics when we have a conversation like this. So I just wanted to make that general point. Closing.
Thank you. As we wrap up today, I would like to give each member